Before we start on our journey, here's a quick reminder of the various periods of history to which we will refer. It's reasonable to assume that one era blended into another, with significant overlap. The Glens of Antrim, castles, culture, churches and crack. Fáilte go dtí na Glinchi Antrima. Welcome to the Glens of Antrim. Sure, I know every stone, I recall every tree, where the green glens of Antrim are calling to me. The Glens of Antrim have long been known for their beauty, their history, and their rich cultural heritage. A long history of settlement and war is marked in the landscape by prehistoric stone tombs, churches and castles. Hidden in the mists of bygone days are the chronicles of the people that inhabited the glens. It is known that human settlement has existed here since Mesolithic times, and since then the local people have developed a distinct identity and a very strong sense of place. What do we know about the people who lived here, say 40 centuries ago, or indeed 1500 years ago, or more recently? What can we learn from looking at the people who lived here long ago to help us understand who we, who live here today, really are?
Join us for a wee while and we'll travel across country and through time, taking a look at places of special historical significance along the way. And we'll use these as stepping stones to take us from about 5,000 years ago up to the present day. As we focus on each of these places, think of the people who lived there, the pleasures and challenges of their way of life. And as we travel through time, we'll toast your eyes to some beautiful scenery and soothe your mind with some beautiful music.
The first stop on our journey is to Bulla. Tív Bulla comes from the Gaelic language, and the most commonly accepted translation of it is Mountain of the Bullying. Bullying refers to taking animals up to the high ground for summer pasture. We asked local historian Dominic to tell us more.
We're here at Bulla, where Stone Age workers stood some 6,000 years ago at least. What brought them here probably was this shale. You can see thousands of pieces lying behind us here. It would have been a kind of B&Q place for Stone Age people looking for scrapers and axe heads, but the shale had a problem. It was very brittle and broke quite easily. But Stone Age workers would have been quick to spot this blue stone here, a much harder stone, porcelainite. This hard blue stone's only found at Bulla here and on Rathlin at Brockley. It's not found anyplace else in Britain. Bulla gained its fame from the next settlers who came in, who were the first farmers to arrive in Ireland, probably about 3,800 BC. And they would be known as the Neolithic or New Stone Age people. They brought in with them cattle, sheep, goats, and also they would have grown a very early form of wheat and barley. And They exploited this here. They were coming from Britain, from what we might call their own people, who had come on a wave right across Europe into Britain, hence in Ireland. And when they made stone axes especially, they had their own people to contact back to in Britain. And the fact that all transport was by sea or river, it was easy to transport their porcelainite stone axes. It's reckoned that there's about 8,000 have been found in Britain and even in continental Europe. So you can multiply that several times to work out the scale of production that went on here and in the other site at Brockley at Rathlin. Now, if you were trying to estimate the spoil heaps there, and these people working with what picks, deer antlers, which would be pretty tough going to mine this stuff or quarry this stuff. I would say it must have been over literally hundreds of years that they worked on this. So these Neolithic people, what about the Mesolithic people that were there? Well, they were either overrun and became a lower class, or else they were wiped out maybe. The Neolithic people probably developed a wealthy elite, and the proof of that would be in the megalithic graves such as Ossian's grave that were built. So they had to have a pretty cohesive society, or else an underclass virgin and slavery who would build monuments like Ossian's grave and all the other megalithic monuments that we have here in the Glens of Antrim.
As local poet Sarah Quinn wrote, "Tiv Bulla reigns king of the glens, overlooking 3 of the 9, and proud he must be to have such a view of his kingdom, scenic, sublime." Let's move on now in our time capsule to the Bronze Age. This lasted from around 2500 BC up until around about 600 BC. And we land on a mountain which is known variously as Lurigithan, Lurig and Lurigaden. The name comes from the Gaelic meaning the ridge of the brow or forehead. Lurig was the location of a promontory fort, and this is evidenced from the ridges that can be seen to this day. It has also become well known in recent years on account of the Lurig Run in the heart of the Glens Festival. This is a popular event with both locals and visitors.
Could you tell us, Dominic, about the people who built this fort? Who was it that built it? When was it built? And what was the significance of it at that time?
It's reckoned that they were built around 1200 BC and occupied for at least the next 400 to 500 years. Although it's thought that they were probably occupied by the Kilts eventually, but it was Bronze Age people who originally built them.
Tell us something about the Bronze Age people, who they were and what the significance of their metalworking was at that time.
About 2,500 BC, metalworkers either came in to Ireland or else their skills were taken in Ireland by the Neolithic, the New Stone Age people. I suppose strictly you would say the Bronze Age was from 2000 BC to the coming of the Kilts about 500 BC.
But where did they come from, the Bronze Age people who came here?
There's a number of scenarios that the archaeologists would propose. First, that there were small-scale invasions, probably from Britain, of Bronze Age people, such as those that were the likes of the hill forts such as Promontory and Derbyshire. They may have invaded, they may have taken over parts of the area, but the Neolithic, the New Stone Age people who were already exporting stone axes and other stone tools by the thousands obviously saw what was going on, and there was a possibility that they just lifted the ideas and there was no real invasion of a different race of people into Ireland or into the Glens here even. Craftsmen of the Bronze Age could have come in and sold their skills here, and probably it's a mix of them all. And I think there might be agreement that at least there were some incomers from Britain and probably northern France.
Just as you refer to these Bronze Age people, Dominic, could you tell us what different culture, what different customs they would have brought to the area?
Just as the Neolithic people brought farming, the Bronze Age people would have brought farming to probably a new level. If we think of, say, the Kerry cow, the Kerry cow is probably the oldest breed of cow in Europe, and it's bred from the Celtic shorthorn, despite the fact that the Kilts weren't to make their appearance for another 1,000 years. But the Kerry cow is still with us, bred from the Celtic shorthorn of 4,000 years ago. So if the cattle can come down that long, then humans could maybe also come down that long. But there's a number of other things that did bring. Their bronze, obviously they could make far better weapons, far better swords. It's thought that maybe they preceded the Kilts with their warrior elites, and that's what this here could be, a warrior elite kind of village. They also would have had dispersed settlements rather than this settlement here, everybody living up here. Probably it was only as a place of refuge, a place of prestige, a place for a communal gathering.
Dominic, you mentioned that this settlement was inhabited for a certain period of time and then it was not inhabited. Does that mean it was abandoned or was it destroyed? What exactly happened to it?
Well, I think that would depend on what terms the Kilts came in Ireland around anything from 1000 BC to 500 BC. If they come in a warlike fashion, then it's possible they took it over, and the Kilts never built any defensive settlements of their own. Their raths and castles weren't built to at least 500 AD. So if they come in a warlike way, then they probably occupied these hill forts. But if Celtic ideas just arrived through trade, through interchange generally of people, then it may have been that there was no need for hill forts, and it could have been that there was a period when defensive forts weren't altogether necessary, but I think there's no general agreement on that. So I would suggest that for prestige purposes, possibly the Celts did occupy these hill forts sometime after either they displaced or integrated with the Bronze Age people.
Knockdhu Promontory Fort is situated between Glenarm and Larne, just above the coast road. It was excavated by the Time Team in 2008, and further by Queen's University and DOE archaeologists. A very large village of over 70 houses was uncovered, and the style of the tools discovered there placed it in the later Bronze Age, from about 1200 BC to 800 BC. It would be reasonable to think that the Promontory Fort on Lurig had many similarities to this one. Moving on in time once more, we move northwards along the coast towards Torr Head and forwards through time as we pay a visit to Altnagore Cashel. This feature dates from the period between 600 AD and 1200 AD. The name Altnagore also comes from Gaelic and probably means height of the goat. As we view this site, it's worth mentioning that we are just about a dozen miles from Scotland's mainland and islands, and this fact explains the significant influence that Scotland has had on our area and people over the years.
There's 40,000 of these ring forts in Ireland. They're called ring forts, kind of general term, but they're not forts, most of them at all. Most of them would just be protective farmsteads, protecting the farmers and indeed their stock from wild animals like wolves at the time and from raiders. The counterpart of the stone cashel here would have been the rath where you had earth and no stones. The earth was thrown up on a bank, maybe 6 foot high, and then you had the benefit of the moat or ditch that was dug out so that you maybe had 12 foot in height and you could put timber on top of an earthen structure. You can't very well put timber on top of that there. The ones nearest us would be at Cushkib, up behind Tivera. There's a double rath there. I think the thing that's most interesting, who built it, who lived here, how long did they live? And we're getting extremely close to our own ancestors. While we mightn't have much of the Neolithic or the Bronze Age bloodline in us, we certainly have the Celtic bloodline in us, and it was the Kilts that built this. And who were the Kilts? The Kilts are said to have come to Ireland in large numbers from about 500 BC. It is thought that their influence maybe extends back as far as 1000 BC. They brought something that enabled them to more or less achieve mastery of all of Ireland, and that was iron. Bronze had to be cast in moulds. Obviously iron was much easier, much more available, and much easier to fashion into tools and weapons. These Celts, it was thought that they came in and overrun the whole place in their chariots, their horses and chariots, but it's now thought no, that this whole farming and iron tool making came in more as an influence than as an invasion. But again, it's a matter of opinion. The Kilts didn't build these, it is thought, as of now, until at earliest 600 AD. And that raises a bit of a problem. Where were they defending themselves for the previous 1,000 years? We could say they took over the hill forts from the Bronze Age people, but the Celts came in great numbers eventually, and well, I would offer an opinion that they used the woods as a refuge. If you drive your animals into the woods and there's somebody raiding, it's not easy gathering them up. What did these Celts bring apart from advanced farming techniques? They brought a religion with them, and the top boys there were the Druids. The Druids were magicians, they were priests, they were political string pullers, if we like. They were pretty all-powerful. The Druids clashed, as you would understand, violently with Christianity. And Christianity got round some of it by using Celtic festivals and more or less Christianizing them. Now, how long they were used, I think they would put the date at latest about 1200 AD. So about 600 years. The Normans were coming in at that point, but that then, or the Anglo-Normans anyhow, these would have been rendered obsolete certainly as defences.
Of course, another thing that the Celts brought was the Gaelic language, which is very much alive in Ireland to this day, and also in evidence in the place names of the glens. Mam Tor in Derbyshire was excavated in the 1960s by Manchester University students and archaeologists. They established it as a Celtic settlement on top of a Bronze Age settlement and dated it to 1000 BC. This makes it very possible that strong Celtic influences were coming into Ireland as early as 1000 BC. So our Celtic ancestors may have brought their culture and customs to our shores some 500 years earlier than we previously thought. Slemish Mountain has strong associations with the beginnings of Christianity in Ireland in the middle of the 5th century AD. Over the next several hundred years, Irish Christianity developed along monastic and missionary lines, so much so that it became known as the land of saints and scholars. St. Patrick's Old Church in the Braid is one of the earliest Christian sites in County Antrim. It is said to be built on the site of the residence or fort of Milcoo, St. Patrick's slave master. The story that this Christian church was built on the site of a Celtic fort is perhaps to indicate the supremacy that Christianity gained over the Celtic religious traditions. Here we are in Glen Taisy, meaning the Glen of Princess Taisy, who was the legendary Princess of Rathlin. According to the legend, the Celtic warrior Conall married Taisy, and they lived here in Doon Taisy. Doon Taisy is known today as Broomore Motte. These forts or mottes are visible signs of different cultures meeting together: Celtic, Vikings and Normans. The Anglo-Normans first arrived in Ireland around 1169, invaded Ulster in 1177, and by 1240 controlled half of Ireland. Celtic raths such as Doon Taisy were seized and built higher with a wooden castle on the top. The MacQuillans, very much of a Norman descent, were to engage in a long struggle with the MacDonalds for mastery of the Glens, with the eventual defeat of the MacQuillans at the Battle of Ora in 1559. It's worth noting that the MacDonalds were Celtic, but with strong Viking, Somerled, and Norman, Bissett bloodlines. Since they all shared the same Christian beliefs, their disputes and battles were political rather than religious. We'll turn our attention now to Bonamarge, built by MacQuillan, but which became a MacDonald shrine where many of the MacDonald leaders rest, for example, Sorley Boy. Bonamarge means the foot of the Margie River. This Andrew Nichol picture from 1828 gives a good impression of what the site would have looked like at that time. We called on local historian Frank Rogers to tell us about Bonamarge.
It was founded apparently by Rory MacQuillan. 1500 is the date that is given for the foundation of the monastery. Well, it could very well have been formed a little bit earlier than that, possibly in 1485. And it's also very likely that it stood on the site of an earlier monastery. And very often a monastery was attributed to somebody, as in the case of Rory MacQuillan, when really all he did was possibly improve it or make a reconstruction of some part of it. And these monasteries, the Franciscan monasteries, they were very popular. There was something like 44 of them founded within the space of 100 years in the 15th century. And they were founded very often in rather isolated places where the writ of the English monarchs, the Tudors, didn't run. And they were peculiarly suited to the Irish kind of life, which was quite simple and unsophisticated.
If the MacQuillans had some hand in restoring founding or whatever, would they have been following a kind of a Norman tradition of founding monasteries, or would you have thought at that stage they were more Celtic in their outlook?
And I think really, you're in it's a kind of a transition period between the two. The monasteries, as you suggest, the Normans, as you suggest, were great founders of religious institutions. But I think this one owes more probably to a Celtic tradition than to the Norman tradition. 1584, the abbey here was desecrated when a group of English soldiers camped in it, brought in their horses and left them inside the church here. The MacDonalds, who had displaced the MacQuillans by this stage, and this is really a MacDonald monastery, it positively heaves with the dust of the MacDonalds. The MacDonalds had replaced the MacQuillans, and they gathered in 1585 when the English were encamped here. They gathered over just across the way there at Donamallet, and they attacked the monasteries with lighted staves, and they set fire to the thatched roof, and the roof burned down. And it seems to have been rebuilt again, and in there's not an awful lot of documentation about the monastery, but in 1639 it was used as a place where a lot of Scots people were confirmed. So it was still in use, had been rebuilt. The Third Order of St. Francis was still in it in 1639. It seems to have ceased as a place of worship a couple of years after that, at the time of the Irish Rebellion in 1641. Although the monastery was founded by the MacQuillans, as far as I'm aware, there's only one MacQuillan who is buried here. And that is, she's supposedly buried underneath this headstone, this rounded holed headstone. And her name was Julia MacQuillan. She's the most famous resident, I suppose, of Bonamarge. And she was known as the Black Nun. I'm not quite sure whether that was on account of her rather grimy appearance or of the habit that she wore. But she was known as the Black Nun, and she was credited also with the power of prophecy, apparently.
Moving southwards again, we come to earth once more at Red Bay Castle, a prominent landmark between Cushendall and Glenariff.
Well, Dominic, I've heard that this was a Motte and Bailey construction, but I know that there was several other phases of building after that. Perhaps you could talk us through those.
Well, there were phases after the Motte and Bailey, but there was phases before it. Probably we're standing on 3,000 years of history. It may well have been a promontory fort before Lurig became the imposing fort that it is. But it would certainly have been a Celtic rath, and then when the Normans came along, they would have built their Motte and Bailey castle on top of it. It would have been a wooden structure. And probably in the time of the Bissets, who were Normans, they probably built the first stone castle on it. When is quite impossible to say. And after that, the castle seemed to have been abandoned as a place of occupation for many years. And you have to come away forward into the MacDonald era before we find it restored and used for living in and for defensive purposes.
Could you tell us something about the most eventful period in the history of Red Bay Castle?
Probably the period about 1550 to about 1650 was the most dramatic and traumatic period, 100 years of turmoil, we might say. Older people in the area, maybe older people of the last generation, would have referred to it as a McQuillan Castle. When that was, there's no definite proof of it. We would understand it, most people would understand it as a MacDonald Castle, and it's over that 100 years that the MacDonalds are going to feature in the turmoil that took place.
Could you give us some indication of the broader political context at that time?
Well, after the MacDonalds defeated the McQuillans at the Battle of Orra, they had control of a territory stretching from Glenarm to the Ban, and they were determined to hold on to that territory. Shane O'Neill was determined to become Lord of Ulster, and the English were determined to subdue Ireland, and Ulster was their greatest problem. So the three of them, you might say, played games with each other. They had short-lived alliances one with another, and none of them ever trusted each other, with very good reason.
Well, Dominic, what was the fate of Red Bay Castle then in the midst of all this conflict?
Well, Shane O'Neill burned it down on his way to defeating the MacDonalds at the Battle of Glentasy. The MacDonalds, of course, bounced back, as they were to do many times, and they had their revenge when Shane came to Castle Cara to seek their help, and 2 years later, in 1567, he was under severe pressure, having been defeated in a battle by the O'Donnells at the River Swilly. The MacDonalds murdered him at Castle Cara, and that, you would say, ended Shane's dominance for, well, it ended his particular dominance anyhow.
Tell us something about why the castle was restored so many times.
The MacDonalds restored the castle after attacks by the English and after attacks by Shane. But it really met its end when the MacDonalds sided with Charles I against Cromwell and Parliament. And the Cromwellian forces, they burnt Glenarm in 1642, and they knocked down the castle here in 1652. And the castle, while they had restored it on several occasions, and the last occupants were obviously kinsmen of the MacDonalds, were Stuarts, and it was never restored after the Cromwellian forces had destroyed it in 1652.
So Dominic, how does Red Bay and all that history that surrounds it impact on the Glens people of today?
Well, despite the MacDonalds being what we might call the wrong side every time, they opposed Elizabeth I, they opposed Cromwell, they opposed William of Orange, but they still managed to retain a large percentage of their territories. And as regards today, the names of the Highlanders who came with them as warriors, and then the names of the settlers who came in the early 1600s are still represents a huge proportion of the people in the Glens of Antrim today.
We move now from one former MacDonald castle at Red Bay, which was destroyed, to another MacDonald castle in Glenarm, which has survived to this day, despite all the political and religious turmoil of the 1600s. We called on local historian there, Felix McKillop, to tell us more about this.
As far as the plantation of Ulster is concerned, Ulster was the last province to come under the forces of the English crown. And really everything tended to change at a period known as the Flight of the Earls in 1607, when the Earls of Ulster had to leave the area and get out of the country. Their lands were then confiscated by the English Crown forces and were parcelled out to English and Scottish settlers. Now, you may ask, for example, how did Randall MacDonald, a Catholic landowner, probably the major landowner, Catholic landowner in Ulster, how did he manage to hold on to all his land when all those others around him had lost theirs? And remember, Randall had fought along with these Gaelic Earls against Queen Elizabeth's forces and had been involved in many battles against them, and yet he still held on to his land. Now, when Elizabeth died in 1603, she was succeeded by James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. And Randall made sure that he got well in with James I, had good relations with James I, and as a result was able to hold on to his land. Now, the Earl of Antrim's estate, along with the counties of Antrim and Down, were not part of the plantation of Ulster. The Earl of Antrim, or Randall, who later became the Earl of Antrim, brought settlers in here into his estate along the Glens of Antrim. Now, why did he do that? Mainly because, possibly because, he was regarded by great suspicion by all those commanders of the armies who had fought against him. He had fought many battles against him. They still were not convinced that he was a royalist. They were also a little jealous of the fact that he had such good relations with James I. But what he decided to do, what Randall decided to do, was to look to lowland Scotland, to the people of Presbyterian stock, and he invited them into his estate here in the Glens of Antrim. Now, not only that, but in order to ensure that those Protestants were happy coming into a Catholic estate, he started repairing churches and started building new churches for the people who were coming in. Now, people who were coming in at that time, local names such as Hunter and Stewart and Gribben and Sayers and so on, all of those names of people who came in the early 1600s during that resettlement scheme, those names are still common in this area today, especially in the lower glens such as Glencloy and Glenarm that we're standing in at the moment.
Over time, to pay off debts incurred by lavish lifestyles, The MacDonalds sold off large tracts of their land to various landlords. By the 1800s, landlords in the Glens included the Earl of Antrim, Turnley, Francis Ann Vane, Cuppage, McEldowney and Boyd. Several different commercial enterprises were initiated over the years in the Glens, including, for example, the coal and glass in Ballycastle, the iron ore in Glenariff and Glenravel. The coming of the railway to Parkmore was also an important development. Some of the industries were more successful than others, but one which had notable success was the limestone works in Carnlough, developed by Francis Ann, Marchioness of Londonderry.
First supplies of limestone went out from here from the Gurchin quarry behind us in 1851. The limestone industry continued, and right up to the 1890s was really the peak of the limestone industry in Carnlough. At that time there was about 150 workers, men from the village who were working in the quarries and the whitening mill and in the kilns. 150 men is a big percentage for a small village like Carnlough, so it was a big employer for this area. And as we look at the number of families living in Carnlough at the moment, some of them can trace their ancestry going back 4 or 5 generations who would have found work and were able therefore to stay rather than emigrate. They were able to stay in the area as a result of having worked in these quarries.
Clearly the most important industry in the Glens has been agriculture, since the time of the landlord system. This was recognised by Francis Turnley when he bought over Cushendall in the early 1800s. He established 8 fairs to enable the local farmers to get good prices for their produce. Although the Glens did not suffer the worst ravages of the Irish famine in the mid-1800s and the mass emigration associated with it, the famine intensified opposition to the landlords throughout Ireland, and various land acts from 1870 culminated in the Wyndham Act, whereby tenants could purchase their holdings. In the Glens, the traditional pattern of housing development was in clachans, and the distribution of farmland gave rise to the term ladder farms. Over time, the mechanisation of farming required larger holdings to ensure profitability, and today farming is mainly a part-time occupation, with farmers supplementing their income with other work. There was also a strong tradition of seafaring in the Glens over the years. Nowadays there's a much wider range of occupations which all help to sustain the community. In the Glens, the Irish proverb "Ar sceach a chéile a mhuireann na daoine" is very appropriate. People depend on each other. Tourism represents another important industry for the Glens, and has been since the opening of the Antrim Coast Road in the 1830s. Every year saw a growing influx of visitors from other parts of Ireland, Scotland, England and beyond. This trend has developed to the present day. Visitors appreciate the sense of community they find in the area. This is reflected in the way that people come together to organise events for themselves and others. A highlight of the year for the community and tourists alike is the Heart of the Glens Festival. This is essentially run for the community, by the community, and the large numbers of visitors who attend are all made very welcome. Over the years, many who came as visitors to the Glens have met their future spouse here and have chosen to come and settle down. Another interesting point about the Glens is the success that Glens women have in coaxing their husbands to come and live here. This has resulted in a regular influx of new family names to the area. blue hills of Antrim I see in my dreams, the high hills of Antrim, the glens and the streams. In the sunlight and shadow, in weal and in woe, the sweet vision haunts me wherever I go. Well, what does all we have seen tell us about who we who live here today really are? We are undoubtedly a mixture of many cultures and influences. Of course, we should view this as a process of enrichment rather than dilution. However, unless you can trace your roots back about 4,000 years, let's just accept that you're probably a runner, a blow-in.